Alright, here we are again working on the Sd.kfz. This video we're going to work on the other diff. I thought I'd include this because I build this one a lot faster and a lot more efficient than the first one. So this is the diff that we worked on last time, and I'm just adding in a little bit more detail. That front square section was a little bit too sharp, so just adding in extra row of vertices and chamfering the front edge there, and then just tumbling around to the top casing, just moving around some vertices, just softening the ribs that sort of go through that outer casing. All right, so moving to the other diff, I'm going to use the end cap from the first one as our starting point, since both diffs are quite similar on that end. So just copying that across using the shift move command, and then grabbing the end face and extruding it. Next, I've switched to a top view and used the slice plane to cut in some extra rows of geometry, and then selecting those 6 faces and extruding them out, and then using the align tools to put all the vertices back along the same line and sort of square it up a little bit, removing that taper, and then using the slice plane tool again to cut in an extra row of vertices. And I'm going to work on that top sort of recessed section, and then selecting the top ribs faces and extruding them out, and now working on that front little sort of lip section, again just using the extrude tool, and then using the align to snap all the vertices to the same plane, and then just using the fillet tool, the chamfer tool, to give a bit of a curve. But the chamfer tool does add extra edges to our geometry, so I'm just fixing the flow of those edges using the cut tool, and then selecting these front faces using the slice plane again to put in an extra row, which gives me 4 faces on that sort of triangular edge, and also gives me a bit more geometry to get a nicer curve around that edge. So next I'm just recessing that center row of vertices and then pulling them out with the extrude tool again, and then using the weld tool to weld all those vertices together, and just pushing the edge vertices out there to get a smoother curve. And again, just aligning everything, making it nice and straight in the orthographic cameras. All right, now I'm pretty happy with that side, so we'll move around to the other side of this differential. So first thing I'm going to do is add in those sort of rib details. So again, I'm going to do this the same way we did in the first object, but to make things easier, I'm going to take off that front face that we started with. So selecting the faces that make it up, and then using the detach tool, I'm going to detach it as a separate object, and then use the isolate element tool and just make sure that it is still there, and we're just working on this sort of detached differential housing, and we'll add the other face back together later. So now I'm just tumbling around trying to figure out how many of those sort of ribs I need to put in, and then just selecting the edges in a loop, and then chamfering, and then selecting those new faces that we've created using the extrude tool to sort of pull them out. And then just tumbling around to this side bit here, you can see there's an extra little rib that I just wanted to put in there. So again, just choose the edge, chamfer tool, extrude, and then just clean up any unnecessary faces that you've got in there. And then I wanted to bridge the gap in here, but the bridge tool wasn't working, so I just selected the edges and extruded them out with the shift tool, shift and the move tool. And again, I can see I've got a 5-sided face in here. So I'm just going to cut in some extra geometry. Follow this loop all the way through. Just moving that row of vertices across so there's room. It's probably not super necessary to do this on a hard edge model, but I'd like to get into the habit of having 4-sided faces everywhere where possible. And we might need to add more detail to this later with a mesh smooth, so it'll just make it easier down the track. So here I'm just trying to figure out the best way to cut in that extra row of vertices and faces to clean up that flow of geometry. And you can see I've still got a little triangle there, but I can easily get rid of that just by deleting a face. There we are, no more triangles. Alright, so that's the ribs put in and that curved section on the front. Now we want to work on that, the placement of that on the sort of chassis rail, and then the sort of rectangular block coming out the rear side of it. We're going to do this by just creating a box as a separate object, and then scaling it to the rough size that we want it, and then sort of looking at where we're going to intersect it with our diff object and putting in the right amount of subdivisions just to make cutting this in a lot easier. So once we've got the vertical subdivisions, I then put in some horizontal ones to line up with those ribs in the engine, in the diff housing. And this will make sense in a little bit when we start to attach these two together. So I'm just pretty happy with the placement of that. I'm going to just tumble around, see how it's going to intersect with the other faces. And then I'm just going to move it out the way, select the faces that we're going to cut out. So again, just counting the edges, making sure that I'm deleting the right amount of faces to match up with the edges of the rectangle that we made, and then just hitting the delete key to remove them. Then we can put our rectangle back and we can start using the first attach the two objects. So we'll select the diff housing and attach it to the new rectangle. So working in the front view here, I'm just lining up the vertices of this rectangle to roughly line up with where they're going to intersect with the diff housing. And then in the side view, I'm just pushing them back to line up with the sort of round curve. So that's pretty roughly where we're going to attach everything. We'll attach the rectangle and the diff housing together so they're the one object. That way we can use the target weld tool to weld everything together. I'm just going to speed it up here because this is pretty simple, just going around target welding everything. And we're pulling the diffs vertices to the squares so that we get that nice, we keep the squareness of that rectangle. And then just tweaking the edge ones just to make sure we have a nice flow in that transition from round to square edge. And I think here I wanted to add in another rib on that diff housing. So same as last time, just extruding and then just pushing the vertices around to get a nice smooth flow. So while I was working on this, I had the reference images up on my other monitor, constantly referring to them, and all the different views available, just to make sure that building this as accurately as possible. You definitely see things in some views that you can't in the others, and it all just adds to the realism the more detail we can put in. All right, so that's pretty much the finished state. You can see it's a bit faceted, so just selecting all the faces and then using the auto smooth, you can get the sort of finish that we're after, that sort of soft cast metal look. There isn't really any sharp edges on this, so where there are on my model, I'm just going to use the chamfer tool to soften that sort of edge. But again, the chamfer tool is handy, but it can make some triangles in our model. So just making sure that all of them are tidied up. I ended up just selecting those new triangle faces, those tiny little faces it's created, and deleting them, and then just welding together the nearby vertices, and then just chamfering on that edge just to keep that flow going through, and then just cutting a row on the underside. All right, so flipping to the side camera now, we're just going to create a a cylinder with the amount of sides that our diff currently has, which I think was 22, and then deleting the diff's end cap and then welding its vertices to this cylinder. This will give us a nice, like, perfectly cylinder edge. And then we can select that end cap and use the inset tool to cut in more detail, and then use the inset tool again and the extrude tool to really finish this off. And then looking in the side view, I could see here that there's a bit of weird twisting going on with the vertices, so just tumbling around the different views, making sure this looks good and the geometry sort of flows nicely. Not worried too much about this model being 100% lifelike accurate. Not on something like this diff, for example, because again, you'll barely see it. But making it as realistic as possible. So again, on the other side, you could use the cylinder, or I've just grabbed the end cap from the other side, and holding shift and using the move tool, copied one across to the other side, flipped it around, and now I'm using the bridge tool to connect the faces to the edge. And then there's a bit of twisting going on, so I just selected that end cap and rotated it a little bit, just to help the sort of flow of edges. And then this rectangle that we put in looked a little bit too skinny, so just widening that up by moving the edges across. And then we'll just inset that end cap, so that if we do a smooth on it, it has a nicer transition on that edge. That bigger end is going to be covered up by that piece we started with. Right, so here I'm just cutting in an extra row of vertices, just to allow a little bit more detail on that edge of that housing, and then just tweaking all the vertices to have a nice smooth flow of geometry. And then just referring to the reference images, there's quite a nice flow on the corner edge here between that rectangle and the diff housing, so just pulling the vertices out, and then just using the extrude and inset tool to add a little bit more detail on the edge face of that rectangle, putting a bit of a chamfer on it, and that's looking pretty good. That's pretty much finished now. So now we're just going to create some cylinders to act as the nuts that are holding this on. So just simple eight-sided cylinder, and then using the shift and move tool, just going to copy this across to the other side, and then one at the front as well, and then attaching them to the diff housing once we're done. All right, so that's our sort of other diff finished. If you've got any faceted edges like that, you can just select them and use the auto smooth to correct that. I'm pretty happy with that. That one was a lot quicker to do than the other diff. And now that they're both finished, the last thing I did was I started to look at the reference images a bit closer and realized that what I thought was the front diff was actually the rear diff, and vice versa. So I ended up flipping them around and moving all these sort of chassis rails that we've got, and making sure they're all lined up a bit more accurately. You can see I put some extra detail on the first diff that we created, some nuts. And then what I've done here is created two long cylinders that sit where our axles do, and we'll use that to line up where the diffs should sit. I decided to put the diffs exactly where the center of the wheels will be. So you can see here I've turned on the reference images, and I'm just lining up the diffs with these cylinders, which are sort of the exact center point of our axle, and then moving the chassis rails to a bit more accurate spot. So because the reference images are showing the chassis upside down, I think this is where we had a bit of confusion. So this is where I realized what I thought was the front of the chassis rails was actually the rear. So just squaring that off, and then at the rear of the vehicle, the chassis rails have that sort of long skinny arch. Keeping everything as separate objects at this stage is really handy to make any changes we need to. We can simply just select those sort of cross members of the chassis and just push them forwards and backwards. Right, so I might just wrap this one up here. We're already at about 20 minutes. So in the next one, we'll actually start the suspension. And that was probably one of the funnest components to work on so far. If you've got any questions or comments on anything in this video, please leave them below and I'll try to get back to everyone. And we'll see you in the next one.